to another live here at the Australian Reptile Park. My name is Jake. I'm one of the reptile keepers here. We're actually standing this time on this side of the fence with Elvis. He's just down in the water there. And of course, we've talked a lot about Elvis, and we are going to continue to feed him on these live streams, which we know you all love. But today we're going to talk a little bit about another species of crocodile, and we're going to compare alligators and crocodiles, because they are two animals that people do get confused between, and rightly so. They are very similar, and in fact they are part of the same family known as crocodilians. Now, this guy here, the freshwater crocodile, and this one here, the American alligator, they are not the only two species of crocodilian found throughout the world. Of course, there's the large saltwater crocodile, the world's largest living species. That is Elvis down in the pool there. But there is in total about 27 different species. But today we're just going to talk about crocodiles broadly in comparison to the alligators. And there are two species of alligator found throughout the world, and they are on totally different sides of the world. This one here is the very common one that you'll typically see in zoos and wildlife parks, and they're very common in the wild as well. This is, of course, the American alligator, or Alligator mississippiensis. I love that scientific name. Now, the American alligator, they're found only in the southeastern United States. So you're not going to find an alligator in California or Washington or anything like that. Where you find gators is in Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, those southeastern states where they do have a lot of swamps and bayous, and that's where the American alligator is spending most of its time. Now, we might start to talk about a few of the differences between crocs and gators, and there are quite a number. I guess one of the obvious ones you might see right here, right now, is coloration. Now, right now, it's a little bit cool, and therefore this freshwater crocodile is a little bit darker than it might typically be. Usually, if it were really nice and warm, the freshwater crocodile is quite a nice sandy, cream-coloured crocodile, so quite a light-coloured animal. Whereas if we compare that to the American alligator, it is a very dark-coloured animal, and that's simply got to do with some of the, I guess, temperature extremes that this species is exposed to in the wild. American alligators, they're living in areas that get very, very cool in winter, and that black coloration enables them to absorb heat more readily. Whereas something like a freshwater crocodile, which is only found in northern Australia, they are our endemic species, they're quite close to the equator, so they don't really need to be a darker colour in order to heat up. It's hot enough as it is. In fact, they want to be a bit of a lighter colour to reflect heat, if anything. Now, if I'm just going to turn the croc and the gator like this, you'll notice the shape of the snout. Now, an alligator has quite a broad, rounded snout in comparison to a croc. Now, a freshwater crocodile is quite an extreme example of a long, slender snout, and very sharp teeth, of course, as well. The saltwater crocodile, a little bit broader jaw than this, but still, in comparison to a gator, all the crocodiles, for the most part, do have a relatively slender jaw. Now, the freshwater crocodile is primarily a fish-eating crocodile. In the wild, that's what the majority of their diet consists of. They will, of course, take a frog or a small mammal or another reptile if they were given the opportunity, but for the most part, their jaw and their teeth are designed for feeding on fish. Whereas if we look at the broader snout of the alligator, what it's really designed for is crushing with a lot of force. So they're going to be feeding on things like turtles and crustaceans, things that have a hard exterior and they really need to crush down onto with a lot of force. And of course, having a broader jaw enables them to do that really nicely. You can imagine this freshwater crocodile trying to crunch down on something like a turtle with its long, slender snout. It's going to have a bit of difficulty, whereas the alligator, far better designed for doing that. Now, look at the teeth as well. Of course, this freshie hasn't closed its mouth at all the whole time I've had him out. He's a little bit grumpy, but that's all right. But if he were to close his mouth, what you would notice, and I'm going to pop him down for a second, the teeth of the freshwater crocodile and all crocodiles, they interlock like this, a little bit like the zipper on a jacket. Whereas if you look at this alligator's snout and mouth, and it's got its mouth closed at the moment, you can only see the top teeth when the mouth is closed. So on a croc, you will be able to see both the upper and the lower sets of teeth, whereas on a gator like this, typically when the mouth is closed, you can only see that top set. But if I tickle him on the snout here, he's going to open up, and now we can see those lower teeth as well. But when the mouth is closed, they kind of slip into little sockets in the upper jaw, rendering them invisible. Now we're going to pop this gator away as well. This is just, of course, a young animal, just a couple of years of age. He's got a lot of growing to do. Male American alligators can get up to about 4 meters in length, maybe even a little longer, and up around the maybe 500 kilo marks. That is an enormous animal. Of course, the saltwater crocodile growing even larger. But all the crocodilians, they start life very, very tiny. And I've actually got a special treat for us today. I've got a couple of quite young hatchling American alligators. Of course, if you've ever visited the park, particularly in summer, you would see us feeding the American alligators, the adults, off the ramp up in the big lagoon. And if it's around December, January, we'll often point out females sitting on nests throughout the lagoon. Of course, the American alligators in our gator lagoon, they go through their reproductive cycle, and the females, they will deposit eggs, and they typically do that around Christmas time, or even between Christmas and New Year's. That's typically consistently when they tend to lay their eggs. And when those eggs are incubated, this is what hatches out. Now, this is a little bit larger than when they're fresh out of the egg. This one was actually hatched back in March. And when it first hatched, it was actually about maybe a third of the size of this. So they do start out very, very tiny, down around that 50-gram mark. But once they're out of the egg and once they've absorbed their yolk, they will begin to feed, of course, on their own. And they're feeding on very tiny things to begin with. And then they begin to put on a lot of size. Of course, like anything, they have a very substantial growth period in that first period of their life. And then as they grow and as they mature, their growth tends to slow right down. They don't necessarily stop growing throughout their life. A lot of people ask us if Elvis is still growing. He may be, but it's a very, very slow incremental growth. Whereas on these young crocodilians, it's much more obvious visually. Now, speaking of growing, of course, in order to do that, they have to eat. And so what I've got for this little gator today is a little bit of food. Now, of course, they do like to eat in the water. So I've got a little pool of water there. And all I'm going to do is present him with a little bit of food. I'm going to take the tongs with him. And just like that, he's going to get it down. Now, this would be one of the cutest things you'll ever see. And you may even hear a little bit of squeaking going on. That sound is the sound that hatchling and young American alligators will do in order to communicate with their mum. Now, of course, in the wild, no one's going to the nest and taking the eggs out and artificially incubating them. What those eggs are doing, they're going the full term within the nest, they're hatching out, and then they do need to make their way down to the water, and that's, of course, where they're going to be at their most vulnerable. And so they want their mum to be nice and close. And so what they'll do when they hatch out of the egg, they will make that sound that we just heard there, that squeaking sound, and then the mum will come to the nest. She'll look through it, and some of the eggs may have hatched already, some may still be waiting to hatch, and she'll grab the eggs that are starting to hatch, and we're going to pop them back in there.
Nice save.
We can move on to the next one. She'll grab the babies that are hatching, and she'll actually transport them in her mouth down to the water. So she protects them for that first period of their life, and keeps them nice and safe. So that sound we heard there, that's actually them basically communicating. Very, very cute. You can see they're very good swimmers straight off the bat, straight from the egg. They go into the water. Here you go. And that is, of course, where they're spending most of their life. They are basking out on the land, of course. They need that sunlight and that UVB in order to grow and develop and warm themselves. They're an ectothermic animal, so they really are reliant on the sun, and it's not uncommon, particularly on a beautiful sunny day like today, to see a lot of our alligators out of the water up on the bank in the Gator Lagoon. But the water is really where they feel most protected and where they are spending a lot of their time. Now, I don't think that one's going to stay in the water if I leave him alone too long, so I'm going to pop... there you go. I'm going to pop this one back with his brother in the little container here for the minute. Because what I want to finish on is a very famous alligator that lives here at the Reptile Park, and her name is Rosie. Now, if ever you visited the park and watched one of our daily reptile shows, especially with Ranger Mick. You would have met Rosie already. And this is her. Now, she's a beautiful animal. She's a female. And in all crocodilians, the female stays smaller than the male. It's what we call sexual dimorphism. So the male gets much larger, much bulkier than the smaller female. So when Rosie was hatched from her egg, we knew that she was a girl because of the temperature that the egg was incubated at. Males, they develop in warmer eggs, so slightly warmer incubation, and you're going to end up with a male. Cooler incubation, end up with a female. So we knew she was a girl, and she was raised, and she's been used in educational shows like our morning and afternoon reptile shows throughout her life. She's a very quiet alligator, very used to people, loves a pat, loves a scratch, and if I'm lucky, I'm just going to reposition her, and she'll just sit here, hopefully nice and quietly, while we answer some questions. Maybe not. She wants to go on the move. You gonna sit here?
How fast would Rosie be able to run?
She's pretty slow, to be honest. Most crocodilians are. Of course, they have fairly short legs in comparison to their bodies, especially once they start to get the size of Elvis. That's a 500 kilo animal with relatively short, stumpy legs. So once they're out of the water, they're fairly slow. But some of the smaller ones, I mean, the freshwater crocodile from Australia is quite famous for being able to get a little bit of speed up, but certainly nothing in comparison to a mammal.
Would you say that crocs or gators are faster on land?
Probably crocodiles overall, although, I mean, it always gets a bit hairy out in the middle of summer when we're feeding our gator lagoon because we've got a lot of animals out there, 50 gators out there living in that lagoon. And when there's food involved, the girls can get a lot of speed up if they need to, but overall, there's some species of crocodile, like Cuban crocodiles and the freshwater crocodile, like I spoke about, which probably, you know, are a bit have a bit over alligators in terms of speed.
Do their diets vary at all?
Yeah, so a little bit. I mean, they're all, for the most part, carnivorous, so they're feeding on a variety of different meat. But for the most part, as I mentioned, an alligator is wanting to feed on a smaller food item, so something like a bird or a small mammal or a turtle or a crustacean. Whereas a big croc like Elvis, of course, he's not going to bother with a little crab. What he wants to be feeding on is a medium to large-sized mammal. That's something that's really going to sustain him and something he might be able to rip 20 or 30 kilos off of. So in the wild, he would almost exclusively be feeding on something like a wallaby, kangaroo, water buffalo, that kind of thing. Now, we had a quick look at the feet there just before, and what you'll notice on crocodilians is they have webbed feet, a bit like a duck, and of course that enables them to swim quite nicely through the water. A lot of them do, of course, I mean, they use their tail to swim along, and they can get quite a bit of speed up. But if they're feeling lazy, they might just use their feet and walk along the bottom, which alligators tend to do a lot because typically they're living in fairly, I guess, shallow bodies of water, slow-moving streams, that kind of thing.
How many other species of crocodilian are there?
So in total, there's about 27 species, and they're found right throughout the world. We only have 2 here in Australia, the saltwater and the freshwater crocodile. But in places like South America, there is quite a number of species. You get caiman, you get crocs, American crocodiles, right through Central America and also into the United States. And in Asia, there is a lot of species. Our own saltwater crocodile is found throughout much of Southeast Asia as well. And then there's quite a number of others. A really famous crocodile or crocodilian is found in India and Nepal, and that's known as the gharial. And if you've never seen that before, try and Google it because they are a very peculiar looking crocodilian. They have a very long, slender snout, even more so than the freshwater crocodile. And some of them will have a huge bulbous nasal disc on the end, so it almost looks like they've got a tennis ball on the end of their snout. They're quite unique looking.
So we know when we talk about Elvis, we talk about how he loses teeth and they regrow. Does the same thing happen with alligators?
Yeah, correct. So the same thing happens throughout their life. They will replace their teeth, and they may go through quite a number of sets of teeth throughout their entire life. And of course, I mean, they're strong, but they're brittle at the same time. And so what can happen is they can bite something really hard and they might accidentally break off a tooth prematurely, but they'll just replace that in time.
Can you talk about her Rosie's eyes and her eyelids?
Oh yeah, for sure. Let's see if I can just readjust her here so I can hold her with one hand. Maybe not. She wants to be
She's very
well
particular.
supported.
Yeah.
She's very particular. You gonna stay still for me? Well, what we're gonna talk about, I'm gonna pop her up here. Just don't go for a swim with Elvis. is her eye. And you may notice if I touch her eye just here, she has what we call a nictating membrane, which is a tiny membrane that extends over the eye. And basically what that enables them to do is go underwater, keep their eye open, but they have like an inbuilt pair of swimming goggles. So it's quite an incredible thing. I'll show you one more time. If we touch her eye, you can see it coming back and forth across there like that. Going to give us a few blinks to really show it off. And that's exactly what they would be doing underwater, is just keeping that membrane closed across the eye so that they can keep their eyes safe and they can see a little better. Now, something else they'll do, they have a backward facing tongue. It's called a palatal valve. And so when they're swallowing something, you'll see in all crocodilians, they lift their head up and out of the water. You may have even seen it in the small gators there before. They keep their head up out of the water because that valve has to open in order for food to go down into the stomach. And if it's open, they can get a big rush of water down the throat, which they don't want. So they keep the head up and out of the water while they swallow something, and then they can go back under after that.
Is there a difference between the amount of eggs that a croc and a gator can lay?
Yeah, so it's more so dependent on the size of the female. So a smaller female will lay a smaller clutch. But in most crocodilians, a very large female, she might lay between 40 and 60 eggs. Here at the park, we have some extremely large female alligators that have even laid more than that. The most I've seen personally was up around 70 eggs from a very large female. So quite impressive. And when they're, of course, full of eggs, they're very, very fat. And then, we come in one day and they look a little thinner and they're being really protective of their nest. That's something that's quite unique in crocodilians, is the mothers are really great when it comes to protecting their eggs, and they're very nest defensive. So we do have to be cautious around breeding season, because a usually timid and relaxed female American alligator can turn into a very dangerous animal when there's her own eggs involved. So in order to remove the eggs from the nest, which we do to be on the safe side, we don't want them hatching out in the lagoon, and we also don't want all of them to hatch. We will sometimes just distract the female, keep her away, or if that's not working, then we might have to restrain the female, and then we can safely remove the eggs.
Do crocs and alligators have similar lifespans?
Yeah, so again, it's variable depending on species, and of course captivity, the wild, a little bit different. You may get a croc that lives a little bit longer in captivity, just because there's not that same amount of pressure on them from various things. But the longest lived croc that I know of was a freshwater crocodile that lived in excess of 120 years. Now that's a bit of a, on the higher end of the scale. They actually have a very similar lifespan to a human most times. So between 80 and 100 years is a pretty good life for a crocodilian. And something interesting you'll see in the really old animals is they actually, like a human, sometimes they'll lose all their teeth. So we spoke about them replacing their teeth throughout their life. That does have an expiration date. Eventually they will just lose all the teeth and they don't start to replace. And so you might have a croc that's 100 plus years old, and it looks like it's 100 plus years old. It's lost all its teeth, and it's looking pretty sad and sorry. And of course, once you lose your teeth, it's pretty hard for you to feed properly. So sometimes that can be what causes their death. But yeah, that's something interesting that does occur.
So Rosie's sitting really well for us at the moment.
Finally.
Can you explain these little spots on her face?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you'll see the tiny little black dots scattered throughout her snout, on the upper and the lower snout. And those are what we call integumentary sense organs. They're just tiny little sensory organs that allow crocodiles and alligators to pick up on vibrations created in the water. So if she were underwater, they are incredibly sensitive and tuned in to any vibrations due to those little black dots. And that is really what enables them to hone in on a potential food item. So of course, if a duck or a other water bird is splashing around in the water, that gator, even though it might be dirty brown water that she can't see in, she can use that sensory organ or those sensory dots, and she'll be able to hone in on exactly where those vibrations are coming from. So it's something they'll utilize in hunting, but I'm sure they use it for detecting the presence of other things as well. Maybe it stops them from running into things or lets them know there's another alligator around. So yeah, really highly evolved animals, quite spectacular. We've got a lot of alligators here at the park, of course, as well as big Elvis. We can't wait for you to get back here to the park and see them all again. Of course, we're coming into spring now, tomorrow, and so in a few weeks, once the weather warms up a little bit more, we will actually begin to feed all our alligators again. We typically don't feed them through winter, but yeah, it's coming into the time when we can get out there and start feeding again, which is a lot of fun for us. We miss it when we can't do it. So finally the weather is starting to warm up, and yeah, we can get back into feeding our alligators. And as I mentioned, in a few months around Christmas time is when we'll start to see those females laying some eggs once again.
Well, Rosie has been great for us. I think she might want to go back now.
For the most part, she's been pretty relaxed.
And then we might say goodbye with Elvis. He's coming to say hello.
Oh, there he is.
And if you want to take that from me, Jake, we can hop over.
There's Elvis sitting down in the water just there. He does have his, his eyes and his ears and his nasal disc out at the moment, so he was probably just sitting there listening and looking at what's going on outside his enclosure, probably wondering whether he was going to get fed or not. Not today, unfortunately, but yeah, he's sitting there posing quite nicely for us.
Thanks, just coming a bit closer so you guys can hear him.
All right.
You can see the difference between his size compared to Rosie, hey?
Oh yeah, he's got huge teeth, and even for a saltwater croc of his size, he has exceptionally large teeth. Very impressive. And of course, it's quite deceiving when he's sitting in the water like that, because the water refracts, his image. So he does look about 30% larger out of the water than he does in it. So yeah, it's always a little bit deceiving when you've got a crocodilian in the water. They typically look like they're a different size to what they truly are. I'm going to take this camera here. All right.
So when are we feeding Elvis this week? It's not tomorrow, is it?
No, we're feeding Elvis on Thursday this week. So tune in to the live stream on Thursday. Lots of fun once again. We can get back in there with big Elvis here. It's always exciting times, sometimes dangerous, but for the most part exciting. And we know that you guys love it at home as well, so we will continue to do that each and every week.
Nice work. Thanks, Jake. See you later.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.